Hello, and welcome to LangTime Chat, episode 47. David is here too.
Hello.
He's excited.
Welcome to LangTime Chat, episode 47,
Good job. Today,
with Jesse.
and David. Today,
That could be our show. Today with Jesse and David.
and done.
How is everybody? Boy, heck of a storm we're having out there, huh? Sorry, go ahead.
No storm, actually. Today's episode I've titled A Place for Theory.
Ooh, I like this.
Otherwise, finding a place for theory is really, I think, what I was thinking.
And the indie movie of this is going to be Finding Theory.
Exactly. But this was born out of, was it Jake on Discord had asked about an optimality theory paper?
Yes.
And
you know what? Yeah, I'm going to find that quote because I think it needs to be shared. It was wonderful.
and so I wanted to, because we had more recently talked about, like how to read an academic linguistics paper. And so I wanted to also take a step back and just talk about theory in terms of linguistic theory, just to give a sort of background piece on what theory is and some different kinds, and talk about it in context with conlanging. And yeah, I think that it'll kind of provide a background for future questions. And go ahead, David. I think you found what you want to read.
Jake writes, is optimality theory something useful for conlangers to understand? I'm looking at taking out a resource on tone which is based on it, but it might be a lot more theory to learn than I want to at the moment. Might be something to leave until Christmas. I responded in a word, no, but I could tell you the same over the course of an hour.
And so here we are. But again, especially for people who aren't necessarily used to reading a lot of academic papers, or every once in a while you may find one that's really theory heavy. I just wanted to just situate what linguistic theory is and why they're out there. And so really the first basic area to cover is what theories do, specifically linguistic theories. So today we're not talking about any of the other theories that are out there. We're only talking about linguistic theory and thinking about what is it that they do, what are their goals. And so in terms of what theories aim to do, they aim to identify and describe the patterns underlying language and its use. So in other words, you're taking language and abstracting it to the what some believe are the underlying principles or patterns that drive language and language use. Really, ultimately, theories aim to model human linguistic knowledge. And so really getting down to why people work so hard at describing these underlying patterns, the goal is to say, what is it that is stored in our brains, or what features are there in our brains that allow us to acquire and use language like we do? Some theories aim to sort of describe what all brains must have around all speaking communities, to say essentially every human brain must have these sort of ingrained patterns ready, set, ready to go. And this is how people learn language, and this is how we're capable of using it. So that's sort of like a bigger aim of theory. And it's not that that's a bad aim or anything, but it's a very abstract aim when you think about like what we can do. We're not at the point in science where we can really physically map out language knowledge in the brain. Not to say we won't get there someday, because someday I'm sure some scientist is going to figure out how to, I don't know, do some sort of scan and see every single thing that is lighting up in the brain, and suddenly there's going to be like a diagram floating around It's totally going to happen. The cells are going to light up like a syntax tree.
I I don't want to get too far, but I one thing that makes me believe it that such a thing isn't possible, or at least not in that way, is that what we see, like with extreme brain injuries, like for example, like I think there was one where somebody was born with half a brain, and they discovered that essentially that they just rewired it, they remapped it, and just had different things, working to achieve the same function. And so it's one of those reasons where it's like, just because an area of the brain is lighting up for somebody with a normal human brain doesn't mean that that's where language happens. It means that's where it's happening with most people of a brain that are working like that, but it doesn't mean it has to happen there. You know what I mean?
Oh, no, for sure. No, I was just saying that the
Yeah.
synapses that get sent across cells, no matter where they are, can totally make a tree. I'm just kidding. I'm really kidding.
Yeah, yeah.
But I'm just saying that's not to say that at some point in the future, people won't be able to map out more specifically what a brain does with language. But it is, again, all very abstract, and it really does get to the core of humans being curious about how we humans are able to do this thing that's actually quite magical when you think about it. That as a baby, you're just like, you've got all this stream of speech just coming at you, and no guideposts. Like, at no point do people really sit down with a baby and just word by word teach them language, teach them how to parse language, teach them how to use it. And yet, as an adult, we usually need that. A lot of us are not as swift on the language learning, and so that has a lot of people very curious about what is it about our brains when we're very young and making all those new connections that allows us to figure all that out. And it is very fascinating. It is a wonderful question, but it is, again, very abstract. All right, so that's what theories aim to do. This also means that because humans are attempting to abstract things and patterns out that we can't actually see or deal with, what you end up getting are competing theories where they can take the exact same data and have very different analyses of that data, to the point where it's like, completely different structures, completely different models, different breakdowns, different points to focus on. Some clump together certain features while others don't. But no matter what analyses they have, they don't actually affect the data, right? So like, they're providing an analysis of the data that's just there. And in general, a good theory is going to take naturally produced data. Some theories really are based on, we're going to make up these sentences and show how patterns can work, but they don't actually use naturally produced language, which is really a shame. But anyway, the data is what it is. And so even as you get like these competing analyses of how we can talk about patterns, how we can talk about features, that doesn't affect the features themselves, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to take a little sidestep here and just say that in general, I'm not a huge fan of studying theory, to the point where when I was getting my PhD, one of the steps that we had to do, so there was like this initial paper that was really heavy on data analysis, which was called the preliminary paper. And then there is a second step, and this is like after you've already been approved to be in the PhD program. The preliminary paper is your first major paper that you have to get past to keep going in the PhD program. The second major paper you have to do to keep going to the dissertation phase was called, at Boulder, it was called a synthesis paper. And the point of the synthesis paper was that you were supposed to take data and analyze it according to, like 2 or 3 different theories to show how these theories handle the data. So it was all theory-based for the synthesis. I hated it so much that I chose to do what's called the synthesis exam option that Boulder offered. And so really what it was I could have had whatever time frame I wanted to write a 35 to 50 page paper to analyze competing theories on data set that I chose, competing theories that I chose. Or I could have this exam where a group of professors would write 5 prompts for me to answer. Still had to write 35 to 50 pages, so each prompt you had to answer in 7 to 10 page papers, and you had a week. A week to write all of that. I chose the exam because I was like, I am just never going to sit down and do this unless I absolutely am like backed up against a wall. And so I did it. I think I skated by it. Like I barely, like they all knew like, oh, she is not going to be a theorist. She got by enough. And that was that. I am not ever going to be a theorist, ever. Mm-hmm. And so I don't rather enjoy studying these. But anyway, that's not to say that nobody does enjoy it. Okay, so let's get back to these competing theories. I just wanted to pull up some examples of just how different and just how abstract the representations can be of the analyses of data. And so, for example, and this is actually kind of funny, somebody on Discord made a joke about my love of gnomes, and they were like, we should call Jesse Noam Chomsky, but spelled Gnome, right? Mm-hmm. And like on the one hand, it's like, ha ha ha, funny. On the other hand, it's like, oh, please don't associate me with Chomsky. And so it's like, I'll take the gnomes though. But one of the theories that came out of the sort of Chomskyan way of looking at grammar is the X-bar theory, the X-bar approach, whereby you take language data and break it down into diagrams. It's a syntactic theory. I really focused on syntactic theories for this, by the way, just because that's what I'm most familiar with. But in this syntactic theory, which you could, the same kind of approach apply to other types of data, you break it down into these sort of binary things where it's like, for the trees, you can have 1 branch or 2 branches, but that's pretty much it. Like that's as big as they can get, these branching segments. You can never cross branches. Like you've got to make sure it goes in certain ways. And what's considered the head of something is not necessarily what you would logically consider the head. So for instance, a full sentence structure or clause structure is considered an I phrase, and the I stands for inflection, I think.
It does.
It's for the tense. It's basically, it's like the entire clause ends up being headed by the tense marker on the verb. And so like the I itself in the example sentence, John studies linguistics at the university. The S from studies, or the present tense marker, is separated from the verb and is sort of marked as the head.
Yeah. I haven't seen the rest of this presentation. Did you want to go through these slides quickly, or did you want me to give background on transformational grammar here?
Oh, gosh. And really, by the way, in case anyone's wondering, X-bar, C command, transformational grammar, generative grammar. These all kind of go hand in hand. Mm-hmm. And sometimes are used overlappingly. Okay, but anyway, feel free to give some background. I don't want to spend too much time because essentially I just kind of want to talk about some different theories and then end on what to focus on as a conlanger.
Okay. Well, with Chomsky, I think it's important because you have to understand where it came from, what he was responding to, and then what happened as a result of it. And I'm watching the time. I'm going to try to do this by 10:21 our time.
In other words, 4.5 minutes.
So first, Noam Chomsky hated this, the Bloomfieldian tradition, which is what pervaded before he came out of it, which was primarily descriptive. He created, this transformational grammar. It was based on some theories that were not really supported by empirical evidence, but which are very important and foundational for understanding exactly why the theories are the way they are. One is that essentially it is impossible for a child to learn a language based on what they hear around them in their environment. It's impossible for a human child to actually learn a language just by listening to adults. And part of the reason is that adults don't, really teach children how to speak language, but also they only give them positive examples, never negative examples. In other words, you will hear something like, do you want a cookie? You'll never hear, do a you cookie want? And you'll also importantly never hear like, you can't say this. You can't say do a you cookie want. You can't say that. That's ungrammatical. Anyway, he extrapolated based on that, basically it's impossible for children to learn some of the patterns that they display. Because of that, he reasoned that there must be something in the brain that allows humans, as opposed to dogs, to learn language. Because both human babies and puppies grow up around people that talk to them a whole lot. The human child will learn language, the human dog will not. I'm sorry, the human child, the human child will learn language, the puppy child will not. The dog child will not. And so that, therefore, then, because of that, and because all humans can learn any language, this provides evidence for the fact that universal grammar exists. Universal grammar is the thing that allows us to learn any human language on the planet. And therefore, what children do is they start off with universal grammar in its purest form, and then as they learn language, they figure out what parts of it are important for their environment and what parts are not. They highlight those parts that are important, and the other parts kind of diminish. And so as a result of that, essentially syntax is kind of the purest representation of universal grammar, and all you have to do is figure out how it changes from universal grammar to your language to get from what's in the child's head to what is actually spoken. Because of this, or one of the upshots of this was that theoretically, if all humans have universal grammar, and it's all the same from human to human to human, it doesn't change language to language, theoretically you could get at universal grammar by studying any language. And as a result of this, since English was the best studied language, there was really no reason to study any language other than English to understand exactly how universal grammar worked. Because after all, you'd get there just by studying any other language. Why not just study the one that is best understood at the moment? And therefore, this was kind of especially in the 70s, this is evidence for why we should just focus on English when studying syntax. And then in addition to that, there is a separate thing where it's like if you take a transcription of what we're saying right now, actual serious transcription, you'll see tons of errors, tons of ungrammaticalities, things that you would not even notice unless we actually wrote them down and said, look, we're actually saying this. And you go like, oh yeah, it's weird that, you have so many uhs, so many ums, so many false starts, times where, the verb doesn't match with the subject and so on. This was thought of as performance error, not a true representation of real grammar. And therefore, this was the reason that in syntax transformational grammar, they only studied perfect examples of English and ignored everything else. Basically, anything that didn't fit what was kind of expected was shunted off as performance error and not really to be considered, because you're only going to be studying what was a representation of universal grammar. Added on top of this was that after Chomsky came out with syntactic structures, he taught it to a bunch of people. He went and gave a bunch of book tours. His graduate students would work with it. They'd find some ways that what didn't work quite well, it needed to be changed. And so Chomsky would get very mad at them and kind of banish them. They would go off and form other theories. George Lakoff was one of these who went off to found, conceptual metaphor. And this would essentially keep happening. Chomsky kind of refined his theories, and this is why you have things like generative grammar, transformational grammar, X-bar becoming principles and parameters, becoming government and binding becoming principles and parameters, becoming the minimalist program. The minimalist program being what Chomsky says was, well, this is what I was originally saying and you all misinterpreted. Anyway, and so the problem when it comes to studying this syntax at a university is they kind of like, they never teach a minimalist program straight off. So they kind of teach some older version, and they also try to teach you the history of syntax while teaching you syntax as a way of understanding what the most recent syntax is. All of it is from the Chomskyan tradition. Meanwhile, there were many, many, many other syntactic traditions happening at the same time, either in opposition to or in reaction to what Chomsky was doing.
It was pretty good.
Thanks.
And by pretty good, I mean you kept to within a minute and a half of when you said you wanted to be finished.
Tried my best.
So good job. So yeah, it is important if you are going to be approaching theory to try to look at where it came from, and that can help you understand why it looks the way it does. But again, it is a model of an abstraction of an idea of how language might be organized. And very often, especially in some of these, it's very heavily English focused, as David mentioned. So there are other traditions. David, mentioned that there are other traditions in terms of how theories were organized and looked at and used, being sort of founded and begun across different universities and areas. And another tradition was, I feel like there is quite often a split between Chomskyan and then what gets lumped together as more construction based. And we'll talk more about construction grammar sort of proper later. But on the construction based side, it was looking at larger pictures of what happens in language and finding ways to describe chunks of language working together. And so one such approach is HPSG. Oh goodness, I couldn't even say that. Head-driven phrase structure grammar, HPSG, which was really begun by some works by Pollard and Sogg, and then expanded after that. So like a lot of people do it now, but really sort of that beginning work was started by Pollard and Sogg. And there are some really cool ideas, but in terms of like how it's mapped out, you really have to learn a whole new system. And so on the slideshow that's going to accompany this podcast, or if you're watching it on a video, there's an image of like 3 different ways that you can essentially map out the same sentence, which is Kim gives Sandy books. And like one is a more traditional sort of tree structure, but then another look at it is to say, what are the dependencies? In which case, like the verb is really, the core of the clause structure, and it's giving permission to all these other constituents that are working with it and telling it, here's what I need to be complete, here's a job you can perform, and so on. And then the bottom part of the image is broken down where it's really analyzing where are the heads, what is controlling what other elements, what is, saying this is what I need to be complete, and so on. But it really reads to me like a complex computer program. Every time I look at an HPSG structure, it's like you just are hit in the face with, SimCat and things like that, where you're just looking at it going, a what? And so you really have to understand all of the background information to be able to approach a structure like this to get any meaning out of it. And again, at that point, you're just studying the theory. You're no longer studying the data. You're not looking at what can I learn from the data. You're looking at what can I learn about cognition and mapping form to meaning and how that may work cognitively. Do you have anything to add to that?
I will just say this is tough for a podcast, but visually, you'll be able to tell these theories by look.
Yeah.
And so it's like old transformational grammars. It's going to be these binary branching trees that tend to like move off in one direction and be pretty tall. HPSG, big matrices.
Yeah.
Big matrices that have like minimal branches linking them together. That's how you can tell HPSG just by looking at it. And I'll mention something like this as we continue on.
Nice.
By the way, Doug Ball, great conlanger. He did his PhD at Stanford under Sog and did his PhD in HPSG on Fijian. Wait,
Oh, wow.
no, it was Tongan. Oh, gosh, has it been that long? Anyway, it was interesting. Yeah, I read that.
Another approach is role and reference grammar, also known as RRG. And this was started by a lot of work done by Van Valen, but one of the seminal books that was released was by Van Valen and Lapola. And it was a giant, we called it in grad school the red brick, because it's like you look at the Cambridge series of like books on, different theories and grammar and different things like that. And they're all, they're thick, they're hefty books. But then you hit the one on role and reference grammar, and it goes from like a hefty book to this just giant book. It's giant compared to all the other books in the series, I think. It's something like a 900-page book, and it's just red cover, so we called it the red brick. But it is an intense book. I do not recommend the red brick if you are wanting to learn RRG. There is a much friendlier version that is a much slimmer blue book on role and reference grammar by Van Valen that I suggest starting with because it is much clearer. One of the things I do like about role and reference grammar is that one of the goals that they had was we want something that has been classically difficult for all other theories to really work with. And that is language that is very much not Indo-European based. And so they actually started with data from Deerball and said, if we can find a theory that can work with this data, then let's approach other data that, is closer to, things that have been used. And let's do it on a variety of language. And so that aim gave it, I think, a really cool approach. And it's got some really neat tenets. It's got some really cool things. And so it's like, if I'm going to go hardcore theory and do mappings out, like this is the one I would be most interested in trying to do. But at the same time, again, it's so abstract and difficult that it can be really difficult to understand when you're looking at the data, what you're looking at. These are represented by what looks, again, like a tree structure. But it's basically every time data is presented, there's something on top to talk about the grammar structure that's there in terms of what's core to the clause, what's periphery and extra information. And in RRG, by the way, they don't care if things cross over. They could have a periphery element whose branch points to something on the other side of the sentence and it crosses over all the branches in the way. It doesn't care. Like the theory is like, wherever it is in the structure, it can still point to something else way on the other side. And so on top, you get this sort of like analysis of what grammatical structures are there in terms of, again, like what's absolutely necessary for the clause to be complete versus this is extra information. And then on the bottom, you get all this extra information, the layers of information that are provided through like discourse and pragmatics and sort of the semantic side of like what extra meanings are being provided by the structure that you can't really map out as well.
It looks to me like a house, like a house, like you're building a barn, and then below it are roots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yep. Anyway, otherwise, I didn't have anything else to say about Van Valen. Actually, one of the more popular undergraduate texts was written by Van Valen, just for introductory syntax. And that's where I know him from.
I feel like he's just got a very brilliant brain, and I love some of the approaches he takes in his writing. But again, when you get to that theory side of it, as cool as it is to think about what are all the different layers of information that can be communicated here, it's again taking the focus away from the data itself necessarily and really looking at it more cognitively. And then finally, I did want to just do a shout out to optimality theory since that was the starting thing. I have really only minimally studied optimality theory, and most of it had to do with phonology. It's a theory that instead of mapping out the structure, it talks about what are the constraints, and you essentially like put them in an order where it's like these constraints have to be met for the structure to be considered well formed. Prince and Smolinski were some of the founding thinkers in the optimality theory movement. But I don't have much else to say other than it's interesting to I guess see how other people have analyzed it, but it's not my cup of tea.
I can fill in the blanks. So yes, Prince and Smolinski from Rutgers, they created it, and it so happened that one of my professors was a graduate student at Rutgers when they were doing this. He helped create the Rutgers Optimality Archive, which you might have heard me talk about, because that was what I used as my basis for creating Fiat Lingua. Because it was a really interesting thing. You know, a friend of mine, this is Eric Graber, by the way, Kathy's husband. I forget, we were talking about software. Mac versus PC. And I was talking about how, for like, I don't know what software it was. I think it was Pages or something. I mean, like, with Mac, you can just give it for free. And he's like, well, yeah, that's how software works. They give it to you for free when they want you to take it up and expand it. They charge you later once it's become something you can't work without. And I think that the Rutgers Optimality Archive is a really good example of that. This was a phonological theory, and it was brand new, and it was completely different from anything that anybody had ever seen. And so those who were interested in it were putting together papers and submitting them to phonological journals, and they were getting rejected because basically nobody had ever seen this before. And so what they did was they created this Rutgers Optimality Archive for people who were working on it, since they couldn't get their work published for other phonologists to look at it. This way, you could just go there, put up your stuff. It wouldn't have been reviewed. It might, need some edits, but it would just be like, here's the first version. Other people could take a look at it, commented on it. You could put up other versions. And that was really how the theory spread originally. It just started getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and pretty soon the phonology journals just had to start accepting these things, and then pretty much it became kind of the it theory of the 90s and early 2000s. And I'll tell you where it started and then what happened. So optimality theory started, first of all, you can recognize it really easily because they're just tables. Which is very handy for people that are making papers on word processors. They used all Unicode, like ASCII characters or stuff that would be in any font, and then they used tables. Much easier to do than a syntax tree. But it was a phonological theory that tried to formalize the generalization that anybody working on language has noticed, which is that languages seem to have a bizarre kind of sentience to them. Like, obviously not really, right? But it's like, as you work on a language, it's like, man, it just seems like this language is doing all of these things because of this, or because they don't want to do that. Like how if you look at the history of French, going from Latin, it's like, dang, they just kept lopping off things at the end, and pretty soon you're left with a language where there's no stress anymore, because everything just got pushed to the end because stress was based on the right edge of words, right? And so that was what they were trying to capture. They were like, is there a way to formalize this? In other words, it's like, it's not like the language itself has a sentience, but it seems like there are rules that happen that conspire to achieve a particular aim. And so what they did was they created optimality theory to try to formalize this by saying languages have constraints, and these constraints are absolute and inviolable, but they're ranked, okay? And so a constraint might be stress will never be at the end of a word. That's just one constraint. It says there's something in this language that says stress can never be at the end of the word. And then there's a separate constraint that says all heavy syllables must have stress. All right. And so then, two constraints. All right. You have a word attack. A-T-A-K. All right, attack. And it's got to have a stress in this language with stress. And you have these two constraints, both of them inviolable, but languages can rank them. So the question is, which of these are going to win out? If the constraint that says stress can never be at the end of the word wins out, then what's going to happen is that you have two candidates. One of them is going to be attack, stress in the second syllable. The other one is going to be attack. Okay? Then you have your constraints ranked so that first comes stress can't be at the end of the word, and second comes heavy syllables must have stress. All right. Attack, it doesn't violate the first one, but it does violate the second. All right, because the heavy syllable doesn't have stress, but also stress isn't at the beginning of the word. And they represent violations with an asterisk. On the other hand, attack, it does not. Wait, which one did I have first?
The stress is never at the end.
Stress is never at the end. It violates stress never being at the end because stress is at the end. However, it doesn't violate the heavy syllables must have stress one. If you rank them thus, it gives you a prediction. It says, here is a language. If a language ranks these two, in this one, it says the winning candidate is attack. All right? And that is this potential language where these two constraints are ranked thus. Another theoretical language is one where the ranking is reversed. And so then the winner is attack, like that. And so basically they came up with a whole bunch of these constraints that are like this, very simple and very easily violated. And they started plugging in languages. They knew what the winners were, right? And because they know what the winners are and they know what the constraints are, they can plug them in and figure out what the orderings of the constraints are. And then you could say, all right, like, Turkish, French, German, and Japanese all have these constraints, but we can prove that the constraints are ordered in the following way for Japanese, for Turkish, for German, for French. And this is how they're different, even though they all have those constraints. And basically, this shows you what these languages, quote unquote, value, right? What's more important to them. And so that was the idea that they formalized in the theory. And it's not a bad one. Mm-hmm. Now, this is what happened. They were good once it was like, constraint is violated, constraint is not violated. Then they started coming up with other constraints that could be multiply violated. And then there was like, okay, maybe some languages say it's okay if you violate this once, but not two or more times. And then maybe it was like, okay, now it's two or more times is fine, but then three or more times. And it was the same thing kind of like, with heavy versus non-heavy. It's like, okay, this one only distinguishes, heavy versus non-heavy. So heavy versus super heavy doesn't matter, but maybe this language does count heavy and super heavy and so on and so on. That started happening to optimality theory. And so it started being this thing where like you could have multiply violated constraints, which kind of ran roughshod over the original conception of the theory. And then there was like, okay, maybe there's also ways that you could actually flip the orderings of them in the same language. And then there was like, okay, that's a huge betrayal of the original theory, right? And then there were people who suggested that maybe there is an absolute universal set of constraints. All languages have them, and they all will necessarily order them differently. But then they came up with a problem. Here are two languages. We know the data is different, but we can prove that these constraints must be ranked in this order. How do you explain that? Well, there must be some other constraint. We don't know what it is. We don't know what it's called, but it must be here for this language. Now let's just figure out what it's called. And basically just made up constraints because they had to be there in order to fit this grand universal ranking of constraints that would apply to all languages. And then it got even worse. Because then they were like, well, this works really great for phonology. Why wouldn't it work for syntax or pronoun resolution? And then it just started getting nuts. I've seen some of the worst papers I've ever seen in my entire life have been optimality theory applied to things like pronoun resolution or syntax. And also like, it's like...
And really, the real reason they're being used in graduate schools across the globe is the fact that you can type the tables easily.
It was also just really popular in the 90s at a time when a lot of people were coming out of graduate school. Anyway, so that's kind of the thing. But we should get to the next part.
We should because we are now very far in. But that was just to say, like, if you're looking at the images of the depictions of data and how it's represented, it is very different. Like David had said, as soon as you look at something, you can pretty much identify, what theory it's from if you're familiar with it. If you're not familiar with it, you would be able to look at different analyses and be like, well, these don't belong to the same theory. Like, even if you knew nothing else, you would say these are from different, analyses. And so what that comes to then is, are theories helpful? And so on the one hand, they may help linguists gain insights about language, especially if they are running through a lot of different data points and really working with a variety of types of data sets. It can end up sort of helping to gain insights if you're trying to map out, because I also feel that, like, if you've ever tried to, say, diagram sentences in English, it can help you understand just how diverse the patterns are in English, because you'll take what looks like a very simple sentence structure and try to map it out and suddenly find, like, oh my gosh, there's something embedded in here that I didn't even think. And so it can really help people gain insights if you're trying to apply it, again, to a variety of data and naturally occurring language. And I think that's incredibly important. And so, sure, it can be helpful to gain insights about language. It can also provide ways to sort of visualize language data, which, again, going back to this diagramming example, if you are trying to diagram a sentence structure, you're providing a way to sort of map out what structures are there. And so you are visually clumping things together, labeling things. And that can be very helpful for visual learners just to figure out what patterns may be there in the data. So that can be helpful. That can be. But they aren't so helpful to conlangers. I hedged here and said theories don't necessarily help conlangers, but honestly, I wanted to say what David said as well. It's just like, no, not really. And so at this point, you may be saying, okay, but if theories and all of these theoretical approaches aren't necessarily helpful to the conlanging experience, what is helpful? And my answer is very simple. It's the data. And so if you're reading an approach to analyzing language from a theoretical standpoint, honestly, what is going to be most helpful is just looking at what data is there. And in fact, the resources that we both tend to recommend the most in terms of linguistic resources are so data heavy that, like, that's all you get. So if you think about something like the World Lexicon of Grammaticalization, it's like, it's just reading data set after data set after data set. Like, you get very little explanation in between them. You get some explanation to try to help point to, look at this interesting feature, look at how this language is pulling these things together. But part of the reason it is just so helpful as a resource is you're just getting a lot of different ways that languages can do the same things. And so, like, that's really interesting and helpful to learn. And so the data itself is the most interesting and helpful portion of these analyses to be helpful for conlangers. In saying that, though, it is not completely possible to be atheoretical when you're analyzing language, when you're talking about language. So every label that you use is technically theory based, right? And so that includes like word form labels. So when we talk about what's a noun, what's a verb, what's an adjective, what's an adverb, all of these terms come from way long ago. Like this is really established, but long time ago, these sort of philosophical discussions of, oh, look at these patterns that happen in language. Let's try to talk about why this particular word form can take this suffix, but this other one can't, even though like they both end in the same sounds. Like what's different about them? And so these labels were come up with, were just invented many years ago. Most of them have roots in a Greek tradition of analyzing language. Most of them, not all of them. But they are theory-based. They are abstractions. They are talking about patterns that show up in languages. And so even saying something is a noun, you are applying a bit of a theoretical approach, and you are kind of boiling language down into a way that it is theory-based. Like it is. So it's not possible to be completely atheoretical. And so one way to think about, well, how much theory is the right amount of theory? Matt Dreyer did, he wrote a paper in 2001, and in it he talks about basic linguistic theory is what he calls it. And that's not a like actual theory that you're going to find out there. Instead, what he says is essentially when you're trying to describe language use, the goal is to use the terms that most people will be able to grasp, that are used more generally across linguistic studies, regardless of, discipline or analyses or background. And so things like noun show up in all the analyses. No matter what you do with the nouns, no matter how you build out the phrases, no matter how you talk about the patterns, you're going to find, the term noun being used, and being used in a more consistent way than, say, even something like phrase maybe, or,
Or like fortis or lenis, which we talked about in the
exactly
in the thing today. Like it doesn't have a strict definition,
Exactly. And so that term is not a great one. That one you would want to talk about, well, here's the pattern, here's the feature, rather than necessarily, like being able to label it as X, Y, or Z. And so what's helpful is to really use what's necessary to describe the features and patterns that you want to describe, and be able to share them in a way that somebody else can look at that and say, oh, I get it. I get how you're trying to apply this. I get how this prefix works with these kinds of words, but not with these other forms. Even if they look kind of similar, they're different in this underlying way. And so that's what ends up being helpful, is just enough of the conceptual terminology that you can talk about it and share the patterns in meaningful ways with other people. Overall, when I do look at theory, my preference is more of a constructionist approach. And I feel very fortunate to have gotten my PhD training at University of Colorado at Boulder, which was very heavily construction grammar when I went there. I'm sure it still is, but like definitely when I went there, which that tradition was largely born out of a lot of people coming out of Berkeley, actually. So, and so David, I feel, may like construction approaches too, just from the Berkeley connection. So I did want to talk about construction grammar and like what I like to look at in terms of thinking about language. And so construction grammar really, though, by the way, is sort of a blanket term that refers to a lot of different types of approaches. And so there are some very specific theories that belong to the umbrella of thinking about language in terms of constructions. But when you talk about I'm talking here about the more generic approach of saying, we can look at language in chunks and think about how those chunks can have meaning. And so as an example, when you talk about something that's a construction, and that's a word that I use a lot whenever I talk about, like a certain phrase type or clause type or way to say something, you'll hear me or see me in writing refer to something as a construction. And really what that means is there's like a form meaning pairing. And in a lot of ways of talking about constructions, sometimes that form meaning pairing is you're looking at a single word. Sometimes you're looking at a phrase. Sometimes you're looking at a whole bunch of words working together to create a particular meaning. On the form half of it, you can look at pronunciation. You can look at the word structure, like, what root is there? Is there a base plus some affixes? What is there in the actual word structures? And you can also talk about the grammatical features. So like, especially if you're talking about like a whole phrase or something, looking at like, what is the word order? Where do these elements show up relative to each other? So that's all on the form part of the construction. That's then linked to the meaning part. And in meaning, you can talk about semantic meaning. So, just what do these things mean? You can talk about pragmatic meaning. So what additional layers of meaning, cultural context can be added in the use of this. And you can also talk about meaning in terms of discourse functional, in terms of how these things are actually used in context. And so, for example, if you take the sentence, she tossed it out the window, and I chose this one very specifically. So just know there's more to what's coming. And I'm pointing to David as I say that, just so he knows that I know there's more to talk about here. Mm-hmm. So we've got, she tossed it out the window. When we look at it in terms of form, we can talk about, how was it produced in this particular instance? And so we can transcribe it in IPA. We can say, where was the stress? We can talk about stress across the entire clausal pattern. We can talk about, stress within each word. These are all different things that we can talk about in terms of form. It's just, how was it produced? We can also talk about like what extra information is included in the word form. So for example, tossed, we can say that's, not just a verb, but it's a verb that is represented in its past tense form. But of course, the other ones, we've got she, it, out the window. These are all things we could also analyze all those forms. I just didn't have enough room in the box to put this all. But like she, we can break it down and be like, what? That actually represents the third person singular, feminine, animate, pronoun. It is third person singular, inanimate. Window is, in this case, definite, because it's working with the definite singular. It's common count noun. So we can talk about these just in terms of these are all the different forms and ways we can think about these words. We can also talk about the form in terms of just the overall structure of the sentence with the word order. And so here we've got subject, verb, object, and then a preposition phrase, which we could also break down to say it's a preposition plus a noun phrase. So that's all on the form part of she tossed it out the window. Now we can look at the meaning component, what's linked to it, and say, what are the big ideas here? The big ideas are that toss, and that's when these are represented, they're often done in these sort of semantic ways where like the verb is in all capital letters. So toss is represented here in all capital letters. And then in parentheses, you've got the actor and the thing being affected by it. So she, it. So she did the tossing, it was tossed. And then because of that tossing, we've got this idea that it has now gone out the window. And so it's like, these are sort of like the big ideas and then the interchangeable pieces. So we know from this particular form, we can change the she and it. So we can say, the gnome. Gnomes are on the brain. The gnome tossed the book out the window. These are all interchangeable things, but the gnome could also toss the book out the door. And so it's like these are all interchangeable without affecting the big meanings, because some animate person is going to be tossing something, which could be animate or inanimate, just depending on how cruel they are, I guess. And they could be, tossing it out a variety of structures, whether it's a window, door, or whatever. And so those are the interchangeable bits. So she tossed it and it went through the window to the outside. That is the basic meaning here. However, construction grammar says, but that's not the end of the story, because that's one analysis and that could be one meaning that was intended. However, you could also look at it as a subject with a full sort of packaged verb phrase as an idiom, specifically here with she tossed it out the window, where instead of her literally throwing something in it, moving through the space of the window to the outside area, What it really means is that she stopped considering it, or she's like, this idea of mine, I tossed it out the window, I'm done with it. Maybe she stopped using it. She's finished with it, whatever it is. And so in this case, it's sort of like when you boil it down to the meaning, the only interchangeable units are the she and the it. She can do the tossing. A lot of different things can be tossed out the window in this idiom, but you cannot change the window. So at this point, like to get that idiomatic expression, if you say she tossed it out the door, you don't trigger that idiom usually. I feel like you'd have to have a lot of context to make it like mean the same thing, but you can say she tossed it out the window as a full-on idiom to mean I'm done with it.
Is this a real idiom or one you're just making up for the example?
It's a real idiom.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I've never heard it. So like to me, like she tossed it out the window and she tossed it out the door. Same thing.
Wow.
I've never heard it before.
Okay, so there's a language difference. And from this approach, we could also talk about how some dialectal differences are going to play in what becomes an idiomatic structure. Fascinating.
It's really important, though, because if something is an idiom to a speaker, you absolutely can't change a part of it, as Jesse said. So, like, for somebody for whom this is an idiom, you couldn't say she tossed it out the window. However, for me, who was completely unaware of this idiom, if somebody said about an idea, she tossed it out the window, I would get it. I would understand it. It'd be like, well, if you toss something out a window, it means you don't want it. And so obviously she doesn't want this. But them having said she tossed it out the window versus she tossed it out the door, or she tossed it in the oven, she tossed it in the fire, all be the same to me, because this was not an idiom for me. It was a metaphorical and kind of flowery use of language that I would take as an on-the-fly expression.
Nice. Yeah. And that, too, is like a really cool thing about when you break it down into this sort of construction and thinking about what are the interchangeable bits that you can create new meanings and how can these new meanings be created. One of the famous examples that came out of some of the earlier pieces of construction grammar were sentences like she sneezed it off the table. She sneezed the napkin off the table, where it's like that's not something you can normally do in terms of English grammar. Like you don't normally sneeze something, like you don't sneeze the napkin. You have to, but if you're going to use it, like you've got to use it in a way where it's in this construction that's sort of built on this idea of like she swept it off the table, she swept the napkin off the table. And now by like kind of triggering this pattern, you can play around with what verbs and objects are there, as long as conceptually the whole thing makes sense. And so like that to me is a really cool way of sort of breaking down what meaning am I trying to get across in this particular unit, and how would the speakers of my language package that meaning? What are the important bits that cannot be interchangeable? What are the parts that you can play with?
I'd like to mention that in terms of construction grammar, I think this captures a generalization that I think is really important about language and important for conlangers, which is that it treats these things like, okay, this is a construction where you take, any X here and any Y here that fits certain criteria, and it works. Now, if you go the other route and say, well, we have to define all these words, if you think about verbs in English, it's like, well, we have intransitive and transitive verbs and also ditransitive verbs. But we could also just have millions, like they could all just be transitive. Because you can sleep a sleep, you can dream a dream, you can think a think, you can sneeze a sneeze. Mm-hmm. And so it's like suddenly like, capturing the generalization that you sneeze ordinarily does not have an object, but it does in the construction, she sneezed it off the table, is completely lost if you just say, well, you can say she sneezed a sneeze, therefore it's a transitive verb. It's mm-hmm. like, no. Maybe the interesting thing here is not that all verbs of English are transitive. Maybe the interesting thing is that there is this construction to X and X mm-hmm. that you can just slot verbs into. And that doesn't say anything about the verb. It's the construction. Similarly with she sneezed it off the table.
And it's also a cool way of thinking about languages like English that allow, in my favorite construction, the quotative construction, that allow a variety of verbs to be the quoting verb within the construction, because it's there because speakers understand the pattern, and therefore they're able to interpret and understand what it means to have a verb you wouldn't expect there. Even a verb of motion or other things where it's like, well, that's not something you would normally expect, but because it's being used in this construction that you know how to interpret it. And so that's also like another really cool thing. And so to me, this approach, if we are going to be talking theory and approaches for thinking about language creation, a constructionist approach, I think, is very helpful. And again, it is really based on how can you break down the data, and it's really data oriented, which I like. So the moral of this story is that theories can give you ways to talk about language, but the important bits for a conlanger are focusing on describing the patterns that are there and how those patterns mean, in other words, how they make meaning in context. Those are the really important parts. In general, if what you're reading is a theoretical approach and the theory abstracts language to the point of obscuring the data, it is no longer useful for conlanging, because the abstract is not going to help you really on your language creation journey.
Yeah. Now, I beg your indulgence here, because I'd like to talk a little bit more, if I can.
Well, it depends. You're really begging the indulgence of our listeners who now have already listened to us for an hour. So
I know.
I
know.
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I can hand you the computer and walk away.
I know.
Okay.
But so we don't have to talk about theory again.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Well, we may have to talk about some theory again, because again, we can't be completely atheoretical.
Absolutely. So, regarding theory, I want to share what my graduate professor of syntax shared with me, because we went through essentially the process of learning government and binding, and then principles and parameters. Didn't go so far as the minimalist program, and learned again a bit about the history of syntax. And I never really saw the point of syntax. And so, especially because it would make sense to me if you were saying, this is how things work in the brain. Mm-hmm. If that's what you were saying. And he said, no, that's not what this is doing. We're not saying that these syntactic structures are actually in the brain. I'm like, well, then what are you doing? He's like, well, we're just trying to analyze the data. And of course, like all theories, right? Theories either underpredict, which means that they can't account for all the data, or they overpredict. They predict all of the data plus a bunch of extra stuff that's not grammatical. And generally, if you have a theory that underpredicts, you try to fix it up so that it can get everything. If it overpredicts, you try to come up with reasons why the impossible things can't happen. Mm-hmm. All right. Anyway. And so it's like, well, anyway, all right, if this is what you're doing with theory, well, what is it? Well, it's like, well, if we get this theory to a point where it can actually explain all the data, then isn't that interesting? Then maybe we do have an argument that says that, well, maybe it is what's happening in the brain. Not because we've learned anything about the brain, but because we've gotten a theory to a point where it, predicts everything that should happen and doesn't predict anything that shouldn't. And that might sound really appealing to some. To me, it didn't. Mm-hmm. Because it was like, all right, we're just basically kind of ignoring everything about the brain and humans and how they use language. We're just working with this theory to a point and working at it and see if basically it's like you get it to a point and say, okay, does it match up? Not perfect. Let's go back to it. And then just kind of ignoring again real language data and just keep working on it and keep saying, well, does it match up? Which seemed like an endless, fruitless, and pointless exercise to me. An exercise, really. But it's really important to understand how those who are approaching syntactic theories, especially how they use them and why, and what they're trying to do. So, for example, in English, you can say, what did he give to the fish? All right. You can say, who did he give that to? You could also say something like, who did he give what to? Or what did he give to who? What you can't say is, who did he give? Right? Or what did he give? Even whom, what did he give? In other words, like you can't like pull two WH words out in front the way that you can do it with one. And there are plenty of reasons why you can't do this, but it's like syntactically, if you're coming up with a theory of syntax, you want to explain why you can't do that in English. And so they came up with a bunch of theories, like island constraints and a whole bunch of things having to do with raising, where it's like there are certain times where you can pull things out in front, and there are certain times where you can't, and they're blocked for various theoretical reasons. Now, let's say you do that, and you've got the facts settled for English, ignoring for the moment performance error and aberrant issues where it's like, where you say, wait a minute, I can say that. It's like, okay, we're going to ignore that. We're just going to we're going to go with them and say, we're just looking at the pristine data. Okay. And we figured out you can do this in English and you can't do this in English. The next step then, if your theory is supposedly universal, is you want to go and look at other language data. In particular, you want to see when somebody says, wait a minute, that construction you say you can't do in English because of this, you can do it in this language. And you look at the data. First, you verify, is this correct? You look at it and be like, you can do that in that language and you can't do that in English. Then what you're going to say is there must be a theoretical reason for this. There must be something going on in this language that isn't happening in English, or vice versa. And so then you go into the syntax and apply your theory to the new language and figure out, is there some sort of difference that makes sense that can explain why you can do this here and you can't do it here? And so that's kind of the goal. You keep going, you keep pushing. Everything that where it's like you say you should never be able to do this, and somebody says you can do this, or you should be able to do this, and be like, well, you can't do that in this language. You want to go and figure out why in order to expand the theory so that it will eventually cover all languages. So that's what the syntactician is trying to do. What are you, the conlanger, trying to do? All right. The syntactician is trying to get a better theory so that it could theoretically describe everything that exists and nothing that doesn't exist. But as a conlanger, you're trying to create data. You're not doing the same thing. And that's...
in fact, you're trying to create something that doesn't exist yet.
Yeah. And so what they're trying to do with those syntactic theories, it doesn't make sense to apply it to conlanging. It's not germane. So what might be? And this is where this might work. I'm actually going to jump from syntax and go back to optimality theory. Remember this, let's go with the beautiful version of this theory, that there is a set of universal constraints, all languages share them, and each language just orders them differently. Let's say that you had those, a big list of those, and you can get those by looking at optimality theory papers. And let's say that you put them up and you just start ranking them and say, okay, well, here's some language data that I'm going to give to it. What would happen if we ranked the constraints this way? And it produces a result. Maybe that result exists in natural languages. Maybe it doesn't. Theoretically, it could, based on, optimality theory. And now you can look at it and say, wow, is this interesting? That's something where it's like this theory can work for you as a conlanger. Now, the problem that you're going to get is that these theories overgenerate. And so you might actually be producing something that's completely unnatural.
Right.
But, that is at least something that it can do for you in the same way that going to like a random word generator can inspire you. You know, like you come up with your phonology, you put in the constraints, you hit the random word generator and be like, oh, I didn't even think about words like that, but I guess technically that is what it could produce. Frankly, that happened today as we were producing the poll, and I put out this form. I was like, oh, well, if we do this, that's going to produce that,
Right.
and I didn't even realize it because you don't necessarily think about all the possibilities when you're just coming up with the atoms, right? So that's something that theory could do for you. Something else that it can do is like one thing that's great about syntactic papers, or at least the first third of them, or the first 25% of them, is especially the more modern ones that aren't focused on English, they find some really strange stuff. Then they come up with even stranger explanations for why they're that way. But I mean, they come up with stuff where it's like, oh, what the heck? How is that doing that? That's really cool. And so it can inspire you to come up with ideas for how things might work differently. And also, based on kind of like the machinations of the theory, they will predict things that should happen that we don't necessarily see, or they will predict that there should be sensitivity to certain things that are, for example, invisible in English. Like, and that's something that might actually be made visible in your conlang. Anyway, so like, like for example, this island constraint where you can't move the two WH words out of there. What if there was something actually physically there and be like, you can't move anything past this word? There are times where there are traces, for example, where traces will actually C command something. So in other words, this word has moved from this position over to this position. It leaves a trace. The trace C commands something else, which causes it to be in some sort of case. What if there was actually something left behind for that trace? There isn't. And like anytime there's a trace in English, there is no physical remnant of that trace. But what if there was? You know, something like that. And so that's where it's really important to figure out what can theory do for you. And really, I think that its most important tool is, I mean, first of all, as Jesse said, yes, the data and all these papers, but yes, but like also it can inspire you in a way that just like random asemic nonsense can inspire you, you know? And that's kind of like really, I think, where it plays an important role. Because especially like, and sometimes you'll find these conlangers where it's like, conlangers don't work on syntax. And what they mean is that they haven't plugged their sentences into the syntactic tree of the framework that I like. It's like, but you don't need to. And frankly, it's like, then it's like, well, what are you even doing? I don't know. It's something that I see as so silly and so pointless. But it's like really the syntactic frameworks, that's analysis. That's what they're doing with your language after it's done. And then when they do it, you just kind of you take their analysis and you put a smiley face sticker on it and you put it right up on the fridge. I really, yeah, I really can't say more than that about it. But
I think David's running out of steam on the addendum. And it's okay to run out of steam. We are now well over.
I understand we're over time, but it's like, it was really, for example, you know, like in XBAR, the traditional transformational grammar, trees can't, the lines can't cross. That's something where it's like, try to create a grammar where lines can cross based on the original, research. And then, of course, somebody will come out and find a way where actually the lines aren't crossing and so on and so forth. But anyway, it's the type of thing that can lead you to an interesting result. So there you go. I'm very sorry. We had a neat ending, and then I ruined it.
Well, there was my moral of the story and then David's moral.
I know. Jesse's been giving me a look the whole time.
It's not It's not a look. I think you've said very many good things. It was, just sometimes your hatred of analysis can go to a point where it obscures our own translations, to the point where I then look at a wall of text in something we've translated and I don't actually know what means what at all because there are no glossings. And it's like sometimes some level of analysis just lets you know what pattern is there. End of story.
And it's true that there is nothing that's atheoretic anyway.
And so
It's hard to pretend otherwise, or it's silly to pretend otherwise. Because anytime, yeah, you call something a noun, you've already analyzed it.
yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was a fun ending, I think. That was kind of perfect. And hope you all enjoyed this. And well, happy 2024.
Indeed. Happy New Year, everybody. Stay grammar.
Stay grammar. Bye.